Now, why do you describe Margaret Thatcher as the most consequential political figure in 20th century Britain?
By the way, I'd have to take out the Second World War in that, so Churchill would, but peacetime, yes. And the reason would be, first of all, that she was successful, by which I mean she won every election she contested, so she had enough time to do what she wished to do. And she did, to a very large extent, do what she wished to do. So she didn't really get blown off course. So, like it or not, it had huge consequences because she did all these things. And she meant to do most of them. And then I think the other point is that blindingly obvious but overwhelmingly important was the first and only woman. I mean, there have been women subsequently, but at the time, the only really prominent woman. And that brought a very different way of looking at everything and of behaving, and had great ramifications across the world. And I think the final thing was because of the state of the times and there was a Thatcher-led recovery, Britain's role in the world increased at that time, having markedly diminished in the post-war years, and now, of course, diminished again. So I think all those are important factors.
Now let's go back to the beginning. I mean, where does your interest in Thatcher begin? I mean, do you remember when Thatcher came to power? Were you a Thatcherite?
I remember her as a boy when she was Education Secretary and I was a teenager. And then
when she snatched your milk, supposedly.
Yes, which I was very grateful. Well, I was too old to be affected by it, but I hated the horrible skill milk we used to have, which was all hot because they left it by the radiators. And so we had no worry about that. But I was brought up a Liberal with a capital L, and I was in my gap year in France when she was made Tory leader as opposed to Prime Minister. And I remember this interested my French landlord because of being the first woman, etc. And he asked me what I thought, and I said, "Elle est vraiment horrible." So that was my views at the time, which did alter. And I think my first vote in a general election was in 1979, and I voted Liberal. But I do remember being glad that she'd won. I had that feeling that important and interesting change was needed and was coming, and that Labour had run out of anything. And so I was alert to that. And then, of course, I covered almost all of the Thatcher era. I started working at the Telegraph in October 79. And so I saw pretty well all of it.
So your career as a journalist begins the year she comes to power?
Yes, and in fact begins because of her, because when I was at Cambridge, I got into the final round of the civil service exams, and then she won, May 79, and froze recruitment to the civil service. So that was blocked. I was blocked. I was thrown on the scrap heap, as people constantly said about Mrs. Thatcher. And,
so you were among the first.
And I was a great beneficiary because I was much preferred being a journalist, which was what happened.
When did you first meet Mrs. Thatcher?
Well, I covered the 83 election as the political columnist of the Spectator, and I went round with her. She went round the country, but it would be not true to say I really met her. I was just sort of very close to her physically as she went campaigning. So I first conversed with her at a dinner in 1985 at the House of Commons. And from then on, I got to know her. And I didn't know her well when she was Prime Minister, but I did quite often talk to her when she was Prime Minister.
And did she really make an impression?
Yes. I mean, I think the one thing you could be certain of about everybody, certainly from when she became leader, is that she made an impression. A very different impression with different people, but it would be impossible to imagine not noticing her much.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. Your biography is, in some ways, quite impersonal. It's a very traditionally written biography, deeply researched, full of extraordinary scholarship. But this is a biography of a person you actually knew personally. And I'm interested in, what's between the lines of your biography. I mean, are there experiences you didn't put in there?
Remember, I'm a generation below her. So she's my parents' generation. And so in that sense, that gives you a certain way of looking at somebody. So when people are older than you, you're sort of more likely to take them seriously than when they're younger than you. And it wasn't difficult to take her seriously because she was serious. But I do hope the biography conveys. I mean, you're right. I hope that there's a tremendously strong use of evidence and so on. But I do hope it also conveys the Thatcher phenomenon. What was she like? And sort of what she liked to be in the room with. You know, how did she talk? How did she argue? What did she care about, even in small things? And I think all that was all very characteristic. And I saw quite a lot of that, though, of course, I never worked for her. So I wasn't constantly in the room. But I interviewed 600 people for the book, and that was to try to... Interviews are a notoriously fallible form of history, but they're an important form of history because they give... What they get is what people felt rather than what they very rarely accurately remember things. And so, again, you pick up a composite picture of what was it like to have contact with this woman. And very quickly, I came to realize as I did the study that it's often a way, I think, when you think about something, is you come back to the first point, you understand it more deeply. And the first point is this solitary woman in a man's world. It just makes a massive difference. And to me, a really interesting difference. I would have been much less interested in writing the biography of a male politician, however remarkable. It's much more of a sort of adventure to discover a different character, a different mind, a different set of experiences.
So let's talk about Margaret Thatcher. I mean, she was born 100 years ago in Grantham. I mean, tell us about the world she came from.
It wasn't poor, but it wasn't at all rich. Her father had set up his own grocer's shop, sort of man who would undoubtedly have gone to university nowadays, but didn't, left school at 15, I think, and from quite a poor background. And he was a Methodist lay preacher, so she would hear his sermons when he went on the local circuit and in Grantham. So she often heard 2 sermons on a Sunday by him. It wasn't uncommon. And he was also a local politician of a non-political kind. So his actual politics were 19th century liberal, veering to conservative, but nobody except Labour had party labels at that time in local government. And he became mayor of Grantham. And so he was a big fish in a small pool. And I think that was inspiring to her. And she deeply imbibed the values of a small English provincial town. But like a lot of people in provincial background, though she loved those values, she was very keen to get out. She wanted to see the big world.
Yes.
And I think right from the start that was the case. And she liked, though she was quite puritanical, she liked the bright lights. She wanted to be where the action was. She liked film. She liked sort of stylishness, which is not in plentiful supply in Grantham. And by the way, one of her little ways into that was the cinema in Grantham was run by Mr. Campbell, whose daughter Judy was a very, very beautiful and sang, the first person to sing A Nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. And her daughter was Jane Birkin. And the Thatchers were close to the Campbells. And so there was that little bit of glamour, which of course the Thatchers disapproved of, but they liked Mr. Campbell because he was, I think, also a Methodist or something, and or in the Rotary Club, probably in the Rotary Club. And you just get that little whiff that though she was so serious-minded, she liked glamour, always very interested in clothes.
Yeah. It's very interesting to think about Judy Campbell. So Margaret Thatcher knew Judy Campbell. They were childhood acquaintances, right?
Yeah.
And one goes on to this world of kind of sexy Parisian glamour via her daughter and granddaughter, Charlotte Gainsbourg.
Yeah.
And one goes to London and becomes, Prime Minister.
Yes.
I mean, it's an interesting case of parallel lives.
It is.
I'm interested in the fact that people think of Margaret Thatcher as this sort of suburban figure. I mean, suburban is the adjective that's often used, but you say that she was actually quite cosmopolitan. She loved the city and the bright lights.
Suburban was wrong on both counts because she was definitely from a town, not from a suburb. It was a small town. So small hyphen town values, not suburban values, I'd say. And then the big city, loved London and thrived in all that atmosphere.
Now, one of the conventions of the biography, and you might say one of the gifts of the biographer, is looking at childhood and reading in seemingly trivial details signs and omens of the achievements to come. It's a kind of retrospective fortune-telling. What signs of greatness did you discern in young Margaret Roberts' life?
Well, I discovered these marvellous letters she wrote to her sister. She had no brothers, one sister, older sister, and her sister was away training in physiotherapy and she was at school. And so she writes about the war and about school. Quite surprisingly unpolitical, what she writes. But she was very interested in politics. What you see in the letters is an interest in clothes, which they shared, and they literally shared the clothes because they didn't have much money. An interest in glamour, discussion of films, an interest in men, a sort of attraction to men, and a great competitiveness, which was to do with academic work, and always that sense of wishing to get on. But the quality, the way she's writing is not of a. I don't think she had a remarkable mind. I think she had remarkable character. It's not quite the same thing. And so there aren't sort of blinding philosophical intuitions or creative intuitions or something like that. There's determination, persistence, and then gradually, of course, her horizons widen as she goes to Oxford and always interested in politics. But as I say, she didn't discuss in these letters anyway the content of politics. She would say more about going to an election meeting, going to a dinner where she'd meet a cabinet minister, that sort of thing. This is when she's a student. And so you get a sense of this strong character, quite bossy, hardworking, practical. You don't get but in a certain sense, it's a typical able provincial person rather than a feeling of genius.
But even though she's not talking about politics explicitly, perhaps that interest in clothes and in glamour suggests an interest in presentation and public presentation.
Yes, and I should add to that she always records if people noticed her. She was very alert to that. And so when she's describing going out with her boyfriend to her first commend ball in Oxford, she describes in minute detail what she wore and also the effect she had when she walked into the room where they were dining, that everyone looked at her, in her opinion. And she thought about that a lot. And in that sense, she had much more. She didn't really, people weren't perhaps exactly aware of this because she was so serious, but she loved performing. She was a good actress. I don't mean she acted in plays. I don't think she did much, but hardly at all. But she wanted the audience and the stage and wanted to look right for that.
Well, you're right that she that she won awards for reciting poetry.
Yes.
And this is where her interest in kind of presentation kind of expressed itself.
Perhaps. And this is the romantic side to her as well as the interest in presentation, because people think of her, sometimes they have her down as a sort of dry 19th century liberal economist. This is false, though she had some of those capacities. She loved poetry. She didn't like fiction because she's very literal-minded. So she thought, that she had the funny idea that fiction's not true because it didn't happen. But poetry she loved because she loved sort of inspiring words, and particularly grand narrative poetry, Longfellow, Tennyson, Kipling, and she knew a great deal of it by heart. And in those days, these Eisteddfods went around the country and you recited, I think she recited that once well-known poem by Delamere about "Is there anybody there?" said the traveller as he knocked on the moonlit door.
Yes.
Yeah, and things like that. And she knew they all stayed in her head, so she could recite enormous quantities of poetry, and it appealed to she was sort of elevated by words and also by words with music. So she loved hymns, and she could play the piano, play the organ. I noticed at Dennis's funeral, when she was very confused, very unhappy, of course, and very confused because she was suffering mental decline. And she actually some of the time thought that it was her father's funeral. She got in a muddle sometimes. But I noticed that all through it, she sang all the hymns without reading the hymn book. She knew all the words.
Yes.
There's a lot in there. And of course, the Bible. So she knew the Bible, and had heard it every Sunday for all her life, and again, all that resonated.
You say at one point that Margaret Thatcher was not a literary girl, but you also quote her as saying that she loved language and rhythm, and how Kipling was her hero. And so there is this quite deep literary hinterland that's there.
Yes, and I think she had real literary appreciation without what you or I might call a literary sensibility. So she didn't understand the literary world, probably wouldn't have liked it much if she'd been in it, but she had a real fondness for some literature. That when it stirs you and it inspires you, and if it has sort of grand, beautiful thoughts, quite a Victorian approach to poetry, actually.
And one of the few artists or writers who was perhaps slightly pro-Thatcher was Philip Larkin, who goes to see Margaret Thatcher, and Thatcher actually quotes Larkin's, or at least one of the lines from Larkin's poems, back to him, or slightly misquotes it.
Yes, which is pretty clever of him. What he did was, being Larkin and very cussed, she said, "Oh, Mr. Larkin, I love your poetry." So he said, "Quote some then." Bastard. and she did. And she quoted one, I've forgotten what it's called, but there's a line about "My heart was open like a case of knives." It's about a Victorian prostitute who's been raped, I think. Fascinating that she fastened on that one.
Yes.
And of course, he was bowled over, and he thought she was absolutely fantastic after that. But
her mind lay open like a drawer of knives.
That's it. Which is actually itself derived from, there's a George Herbert poem which is rather like that. They're on a very different subject. But it's the case of knives. I think Herbert uses the phrase "case of knives," and so it has a sort of literary. Well, she wouldn't have known that, I think, but that was very sort of characteristic. And one of the nice things about Mrs. Thatcher, definitely nice thing, was she admired people who were good at things that she wasn't good at. So she admired poets and writers. She admired philosophers. She admired scientists. She was quite a good scientist, but she admired sort of generals. And in her rather sort of naive way, she used to say, like, "If a big man wants something, I want to give it to him." So she was pretty horrible to her cabinet colleagues, but she had a real appreciation of other talents, soldiers, entrepreneurs, all sorts. And therefore, there was a minority of writers who admired her. V.S. Naipaul, Anthony Pold, Kingsley Amis, Larkin. And she was sort of happy in their company.
Yes. But broadly, she was more of a logical thinker, as one of her references for her university application puts it, right? And there's a fascinating bit where young Margaret Roberts is talking about the existence of angels, and she just can't accept the existence of angels because logically it doesn't make sense.
Because the wingspan, the human body, because angels have bodies resembling those of humans. And so in her view, her literal-minded approach to things, that amount of weight couldn't be carried by that amount of wing. So so there must be a problem in her view about the existence of angels. And that's very characteristic of, she was literal-minded. So you had to be careful with her about jokes. She actually did have a sense of humour because she had a great sense of fun, but she didn't actually really get jokes. So you really had to signal they were coming, otherwise she'd get in a muddle. And she wouldn't sort of understand what... And of course she was terrified of double entendre. And of course men are always telling double entendre, and she couldn't get it. She never knew what they were, and she was this sort of worried.
Don't you think that should be a problem typically for a politician, to be so literal-minded? Because as a politician, you're dealing with a world of uncertainties and human complexity and strangeness.
Yes, but definitely yes. And this could catch her out in Parliament, for example, and particularly in a certain type of male dining, drinking environment where everything's to do with jokes, really.
Yeah.
But there was also a sort of simple human directness about her. So she was very good with human beings about simple needs. So her way of being kind to people was always like making sure they have enough food or drink and worrying if their children were ill or that sort of thing. Very, very unlike most prime ministers. So she'd be very aware of that sort of and write very nice condolence letters. I mean, she wrote fantastic condolence letters. And I mean, literally, she must have written thousands of them, all in her hand. And nice, thoughtful things. And this was a combination of her kind. She could be horrible, but she was basically kind. Underneath it, kind. On average, and usually she was kind, though by no means always. And so it's a combination of that and her incredible efficiency. So not only would she want to write a letter because she was sympathetic, but it was her duty, in her view. So that's what she'd do. So she might write 18, when the Warren Point soldiers were killed by the IRA, I think 18 of them in one day. She wrote to 18 mothers, I think, and handwritten letter to each, and each different. And that's a very important part of her and it's why people loved working for her, though not with her. So the secretaries and doormen and police and things loved her, and her cabinet colleagues did not love her for the most part. But it's something quite cozy about her and unpompous. So there was no sort of, she could be terrifying, but there was no sort of, don't you know who I am, shut up, you silly little person, sort of not like that at all.
Now let's talk more about Thatcher's social and cultural legacy. I mean, what impact has she had on Britain today? Britain as a society, let's say.
Well, first of all,
which she denied existed, supposedly.
Yes, though that's not what she did deny, though the way she put it obviously laid her open to that. But it's right. If you don't mind, I'll just say what I think about that, because that explains a lot. She said in Woman's Own interview, there's no such thing as society. There are individual people and there are their families. And then she went on to say, and they must discharge those responsibilities and then from that help everybody else. And what she meant was this. She was absolutely not an atomistic individualist. What she was doing was she was saying, if she was a modern person, she'd do that thing when you she would say there's no such thing as society. What is it? Don't think you can get out of it and talk about it as a thing over there. We compose it. And so we all have duties to it. And we fulfill our duties first to our family, and then we move out from that to our neighbour and so on. And so she did have a very strong, and this was misunderstood, she had a very strong sense of the organisation and value of British society. And that, I think, came from her Methodism, the sort of John Wesley, you owe a great duty to God and to everybody to work as hard as you can to do good in the world. And that was her approach. And so what she was resenting as against was the idea that you ought to lay all your problems on this thing called society, who was somehow to blame. You're in it. This was not always understood. And of course, people said that she preferred some groups of people to other people and considered her harsh and so forth. So brilliant comic figure for them and excellent to drawing cartoons and all the rest of it. I think fundamentally most of those critics emerge rather badly from it, because I think they think that they're kicking against privilege and power, and actually they're being quite misogynist and snobby. So they're really saying, in a way they're saying what some posh Tories said, which is, what right has this grocer's daughter to go throwing herself around the... and they collected female characteristics in their attacks. And there was a sort of trope there that, how could a woman fight a war, for example? This was awful, and it showed how hard she was. And so I think that's on the whole not to their credit. But what is true, of course, is that, for better or for worse, she's a mythological figure and became so very quickly, and therefore is the natural subject of comedy, tragedy, cartoons, films, blow-up dolls, everything. And if you said even now, if you said X is a real Margaret Thatcher, you'd know what was being said.
So, however little she was interested in culture, culture was interested in her and couldn't get enough of her.
Yes, and she was interested in culture because, she wasn't interested in the world of the arts and art subsidies and all that, but she liked music, as I say. She also had an idea of the importance of greatness in culture. So she was very concerned with great art collections, for example, and she tried very hard and failed to get the Thyssen collection to come to Britain, and she went flattering Baron Thyssen, and even tried to persuade Grey Gowrie, the arts minister, to find a lovely English girl to become his sixth wife in order to make sure that we could get the pictures. And this was all to do with her idea of the greatness of Britain, actually, and her romantic idea of the historical greatness of Britain. And so she saw this in her mind like a sort of great canvas of achievement and interest and courage and freedom and so on. And all that meant a great deal to her. She wasn't, as I say, interested in the world of the arts as we think of it, particularly not of the subsidized arts. But it wouldn't be true to say that the arts were of no interest to her, not at all.
But people in the arts and writers tend to criticize her and her successors for their consumerism and commodification of society, culture, universities, and many of the institutions that foster the arts.
Yeah. Yes, and not without reason. I mean, there were considerable problems that came up, but I think what you have to look about there is not so much a cultural question as a money question. Britain was bust in the 1970s, as it is now, and as it wasn't subsequently in between those two periods. And so something had to give, and she had to try to break the idea, or this is what she thought, that the government should end up paying for everything. And she also saw, which is basically true about universities, particularly good universities, is that they could be much better at encouraging the commercial application of their original ideas. And also that their alumni had a duty, and other benefactors, to help pay. Which is, after all, how the great universities existed for many, many centuries. And that's why they always have commemoration of benefactors, feasts and so on, and had gone into desuetude to a large extent because people thought, the state should be coughing up for this. So she's trying to, it's not that she doesn't care about them, she's trying to reactivate them as individual institutions. Now, that was done with independent institutions. That's done with mixed success and sometimes with actual failure. But I think that's, if we're talking about motive, I think that's what she was on about. She wasn't saying, stuff this, it doesn't matter.
Now, what a lot of left-wing writers and critics were getting at there was that society was being undermined by her unleashing the forces of the market. But it's interesting that these arguments are now being invoked by the new right. So I want to ask you, do you think Thatcherism is kind of over? Its intellectual legacy in corners of the new right it's not very well respected.
There's an element of that, but I think there's a misunderstanding. Mrs. Thatcher certainly believed in free markets and believed that they'd been too much suppressed. But she did not believe in the automatic libertarian triumph of capitalism. For one thing, she believed very, very strongly in the nation state and in parliamentary institutions. And of course, you can't believe in the sovereignty of the nation state if you do believe in that, you're not really a globalist. You're not a protectionist necessarily, but you're not a globalist. And so I think there's a tendency currently in certain strands of conservatism to misunderstand free marketeers as globalists, and there's a difference. And indeed, often the examples they cite of free marketeers shows that they don't really understand what free marketeers are, because they then give examples of monopoly. But of course, above all, free marketeers hate monopoly. It's not a free market if it's a monopoly. So I do think it's misunderstood. But are you right about this? I think you're right that the fashion is against that aspect of her that was about a certain type of economic freedom. However, she's also, in some ways, the mother of Brexit. And that was a very bold stroke against globalization. And one of the reasons she fell from office is that she was coming, she hadn't quite yet come, but she was coming to the view that Brexit should happen. Of course, she didn't never live to hear the word. But as she became more worried about European over-centralization, she, in an interview with me just before she fell, she said there should be a referendum on whether or not Britain joins the single currency. And she said the same in an interview to Simon Jenkins at the similar time. And her colleagues hated this because her senior colleagues they began to sense that she really didn't like the way the European community was going. And she really didn't want European Union, which hadn't yet come about. And they were right. That was the way she was going. And so that side of her is very much a feature of what happened later and very much what national conservatives do like. So I'm slightly puzzled by the antipathy in some conservative circles to her. I'm also worried by it for a separate reason, which is that I think some of it's actually disreputable because it's to do with a sort of such a great dislike of globalization that it's actually become to be in favor of extremely unpleasant people, by which I largely mean Putin. So there's an element in the British right, and you see it in Reform to some extent, who actually do think that Putin's better than Western countries.
Yeah.
And, if that's what they think, they certainly are against Thatcher because, she well understood what tyranny was and she didn't like it. And the whole of her Cold War stance was about how do you, without having a battle, actual physical battle, triumph over Soviet communism and also the subjugation of Eastern European countries, which happened after the war. And that was, in its own terms, extremely successful. And therefore, and now some of the right, for example, in Hungary, in some extent in Britain, and quite a lot in elements of MAGA, don't think that way.
Yeah.
And so you hear people saying, I've literally heard people say, including intellectuals, there's more free speech in Russia than in Britain. Now, there is a problem about free speech in Britain, but my goodness, what rubbish. I mean, that's something where they are departing strongly from.
I mean, regardless of Thatcher's true views about the market, which were much more subtle, I mean, isn't it true that in practice, post-Thatcher Britain has become more prosperous and less rooted, as Roger Scruton once put it, as a consequence of her economic reforms, and that that society has become more weaker to a degree, and including a lot of the institutions such as the family, church, and so on, have all declined in direct proportion to the growth of the market.
Well, I don't think it's really to do with the growth of the market. I think it's to do with – I think there is a paradox about modern life, which is that you want people – on the whole, people want to have more choice and they want more community. And to some extent, these things are antithetical.
Was she aware of that tension in her ideology?
Yes. So she would lament, for example, she understood that a shop like her father's shop couldn't exist in the modern world because of supermarket competition. And she was sad about that, but she couldn't stop supermarket competition because she's also aware that when people make the choices, they would much rather, whatever they say, they'd much rather have cheaper goods than more expensive goods. Everybody worries about that, except very rich people, I suppose. And so that's the way it's likely to go. And similarly, if people can travel more, they're not so dependent on their community. They might have, or if women can work more, they're less likely to do charitable work in the community, etc. These are all real problems which she did recognize. But I think what you always have to understand with a politician is what are they trying to achieve against a background? So what she's trying to achieve, particularly in the early stages, early to middle stages, is get Britain moving again, stop the trade union leaders squashing prosperity, allow new businesses to get going, get inflation under control, and get Britain's credit in a literal financial sense and in a wider political and moral sense higher in the world. And what people forget, why did she win the election in 1979? Because the so-called community-based ideas actually produce conflict. You know, the great big sell of the Callaghan-Wilson Labour period was things like the so-called social contract. So we can produce a harmonious society by the unions working with business and government to sort of corporate idea, but it wasn't harmonious and it wasn't prosperous. And it collapsed in the winter of discontent, which is why she came into power.
But now the background, the context has changed quite a lot.
Yes.
And now we're seeing the impact of, some might say, untrammeled markets. I mean, do you think Thatcherism, therefore, is not relevant now?
No, I think it is, because I think they're not untrammeled. They're in many respects too trammeled. And the state is so big. So the state has a massive distorting effect on modern life, and also much greater interference about things like your opinion and sort of that's to do with wokery more than money, in which like non-crime hate incidents or something like that, so I think these are really a different set of problems, and also a lot of the problems you're talking about, which are real problems, I do agree, actually occurred to a very large extent in most Western countries. We sort of dramatize it by talking about Thatcher, and in a way rightly so, because she's a dramatic figure, but actually it's not very different in France, really. I mean, they have higher tax rates, but, you know, Spain, United States in a slightly different way, and so on.
But across the West, don't you think that people want to be able to, you mentioned the example of her father's grocery shop, people want a grocer who knows their name, you know, a small business,
for sure,
and a sense of community. And hasn't this been undermined across the West? Yes, it's not Thatcher's fault, but...
yes, it has. By the way, another important aspect of it, though, is technology, which almost literally didn't exist at that time. So she's the last prime minister who never saw an email as prime minister. And there's no email, there's no e-record of anything in her period. It's all on paper.
That changes with John Major.
Yes, and even then not much. It really changes with Blair. But yes. And so the world, say, online shopping, absolutely unknown to her, 100% unknown to her. Indeed, it didn't exist. And so these are different problems. And as with all great economic and technological changes, they have downsides and upsides. And that particular area of things, she really didn't have anything to do with. So she thought a bit about things like the high street and in relation to shopping mega shops. But of course, she hadn't thought that home delivery would, Amazon and things, and why should she? I mean,
Thatcher's one of the few prime ministers who has given her name to a tendency in society, that Thatcherite.
Yeah.
Do you think there will still be Thatcherites in generations to come?
Yes, but I think so. But it's not really a philosophy. It's more like a disposition. So it's a bit like, in a different way, when people say something's Churchillian, it's not a theory. It's a certain sort of approach to life. And the Thatcherite approach, or the Thatcher qualities, are what are called, some people call, I think Shirley Letwin called it in her book, the vigorous virtues. So it's an idea about what you can do and how you can do your best and how you can be proud of that and how your nation can try to do that, rather than succumbing to the mighty power of rival polities or of the state, rather than collectivism. It's not right to characterize individualism as having no concern for community. It's collectivism which is the danger in that view. And I think, not sure whether the word Thatcherism will survive. I think it probably will, but the name Thatcher will survive because it'll sort of conjure up things,
but not necessarily an ideology.
It's a form of conservatism, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that will last, and there's tons of stuff, not only written by me, to evidence about it, and it's just. I mean, to take another example from history, Gladstonianism. Gladstone didn't have a philosophy exactly, but there was a very everyone knew what Gladstonianism was. It was really liberal economics in a sort of thriving, vigorous society.
Which is in a way what Thatcherism is.
In a way, but she brings something else, which is, and that's why I think she's a real conservative, is she has this, first of all, this romantic idea of British history. She's quite Tory, and she had no trouble with ancient institutions like the monarchy.
Yeah.
She believed in all that. She created hereditary peers even. And she had sort of that sense of Britain as this great entity which you're reviving, in her view. And so she's not some dry as dust economic liberal, though she was an economic liberal. And also she was self-contradictory, as such people often are. So despite all her economic liberalism, she was spent the whole time trying to squash other countries using government power to get contracts for British firms.
Yes.
So in that sense, she's an economic nationalist.